I'd like to welcome you to our panel presentation, What Investigators Should Know About Grant Seeking from Private Foundations. I'm Jim Wilson from the Russell Sage Foundation. Joining me today are Roey Ahram from the Spencer Foundation and Jenny Irons from WT Grant Foundation. Just before we get started, I wanted to give you a quick overview of what to expect. We've been doing this panel for a number of years now, and when we first started discussing putting the panel together, we each prepared our own set of slides and shared them with the group. And it became rapidly apparent that there was a lot of overlap between what we were saying in our slides. So we created one combined presentation. That's what we'll have today, and we'll be going back and forth among us as we walk you through our grant processes. Literally everything that you see today will probably apply to each of the other foundations. So when Jenny is talking about what's necessary for strong grant proposals, or Roy's going over the same issues, it's also true for Russell Sage for the most part. We'll try to keep the presentation relatively short to leave with lots of times for questions. If you do have questions, you can submit them through the Q&A, and we'll either answer them through the presentation or we'll deal with them at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Roy, who will start us off.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for attending virtually. I'm Roey. I'm an Associate Program Officer at the Spencer Foundation. Spencer's been a leading funder of education research since its inception in 1971. I'm really pleased to have the chance to talk with you all today about Spencer and organizations like it and what it means to seek funding from private philanthropies. For those of you who had experience with Spencer or William T. Grant or Russell Sage, this might be a gentle introduction, but I think it's important to know about, think about the foundation and its mission and our grant programs, and that gives you a better sense of where to situate your work within within the foundation space. Like my colleagues at William T. Grant and Russell Sage, I'm going to try and spend the bulk of my time talking about the general principles of writing proposals and taking questions, but I want to first situate this in a conversation about what Spencer's about. So Spencer Foundation is a rare class of private foundations that focus exclusively on supporting education research. It's one of the ways we differentiate ourselves from the rest of the field. Spencer's founder, Lyle Spencer, believed that education research was key to improving education and increasing opportunities to learn for children and adults throughout the lifespan. As such, we focus exclusively on education research and learning broadly defined. What does this mean? First, we're focused on learning wherever it happens across the lifespan. While we fund education research, we welcome proposals that focus on topics and theories and methodologies that sort of approach education from different perspectives. We also recognize that learning occurs throughout the course of a life in multiple settings: classrooms, workplaces, family, community context, even the playing field. Any of which might be the right circumstances and provide a basis for rewarding study that makes a significant contribution to the field. The other thing is that we are field initiated, which means that our good ideas don't come from inside the foundation, but they come from talking to PIs and investigators like you. We don't have a lot of priority areas, with the exception of our conference grants and a couple of special programs. We don't predetermine a list of topics or issues that we're seeking proposals on. We know we can't come up with all the most interesting questions and designs. We're really seeking principal investigators like yourselves to share your ideas with us, essentially helping us set the research agenda. So next slide. Over the past 3 years, we've been talking to scholars across the country about research in relationship to Spencer and other funders. The process has encouraged us to be a little more explicit about our goals and values and ensuring that our funding priorities and internal programs are aligned with these goals. So Spencer is committed to supporting research that's rigorous, relevant, equitable, transformable, and collaborative. What this means is our primary goal is to invest in education research that's transformative, methodologically rigorous, and helps create a better society. At the same time, through our grant programs, we aim to impact the infrastructure and people that make research matter. We're seeking to broaden the diversity of scholars and scholarship in educational research, increase the capacity of scholars through training and collaboration, strengthen the impact of research for improving educational practice, and make education research more accessible to public audiences. So how do we do this? Next slide. Thank you. So what we fund falls into three main buckets: field-initiated research, which encompasses our largest grant programs, training fellowships, and field building activities. I'm actually going to focus the majority of my remarks on our field-initiated research, but I just should say their field building and activities are designed to support all sorts of programs that sustain the research community. We fund conference grants and mentor awards. Those are two primary programs in that area. And I encourage you to look at our website and read more about those programs. Those sort of, they're very niche areas for us, but we're very proud of the awards we give to our mentors and the types of conferences and convenings we're funding through our conference grant program. The conference grant program is a competitive grant program. We're supporting research conferences and focus symposia related to a theme or topic. So this is one of the areas where we do lay out a specific topic that we want to receive proposals on. The Mentor Award provides a nominal grant to nominated mentors who have demonstrated extraordinary contributions to supporting research training for graduate students and junior scholars. We also support the development of training for early career scholars. We fund dissertation and postdoctoral fellowships through the National Academy of Education. You can learn more about the specific guidelines that they have for those programs at naeducation.org. But it's also a great opportunity. I encourage junior scholars or faculty who have doctoral students to consider these as ways in which to have conversations with Spencer and to be part of the education research space. Our field initiative programs are by far our largest. This is where we fund the majority of our research proposals. We have 4 program areas that support field initiative research. These grants are designed for applicants to pitch their ideas to us, not around any specific request. They are what you as scholars in the field think we need to know more about. I'm going to talk about the first 3 as one big group: the Lyle Spencer Research Awards, the large grants, and the small grants. They vary slightly, and I encourage you once again to visit our website, spencer.org, for details about each program, including how to apply, awards, deadlines, and more deadlines will be coming up in the next few months, so check back to that website if they're not up already. So while these programs differ somewhat, they're guided all by the same idea, that supporting education research projects will contribute to the improvement of education. Across the 3 grant programs, our primary goal is to support rigorous, intellectually ambitious, and technically sound research that's relevant to the pressing problems and compelling opportunities in education. We receive about 2,000 proposals a year from scholars all over the world. So for those who are thinking from non-US based contexts, we do support programs and research that's not from US based scholars or US based institutions. We're seeking scholarship that develops new foundational knowledge or may have a lasting impact on policy making, practice, or educational discourse. As I mentioned at the start, we anticipate proposals that span a wide range of topics and disciplines that are innovative and investigates questions of central education. We expect and welcome methodological diversity in answering pressing questions. So we're open to a lot of different methods. And we expect topic and disciplinary diversity, including proposals from sociologists. I'll talk a little bit more about what stands out in the second half of the presentation. Research practice partnerships, which is that 4th, or I guess it's the 3rd bullet before the group of proposals on that slide, is intended to support education research projects that are collaborative and participatory in nature. Just like our research grant programs, RPP programs, research practice partnership programs, are field initiated, but what sets them apart is their focus on partnership approaches to generate new knowledge and improve education. So partnership models work collaboratively between practitioners such as school districts, county offices of education, state educational organizations, universities, community-based organizations, out-of-school time providers, list goes on, along with researchers in the knowledge generation process, and really focusing on pressing problems of practice that are localized within a specific context, within that partnership context. We're open to a lot of different partnership arrangements like design-based research or network improvement communities or place-based alliances. And we anticipate that in the long term, the research conducted by research practice partnerships will result in new insights to the processes, practices, policies that improve education for students, educators, schools, universities, families, communities. So it's the same basic outcome, but a slightly different approach. For those who are not familiar with research practice partnerships, and not to be sort of an evangelist of this approach, I recommend you check out Cynthia Coburn and Bill Penuel's work. They had a 2016 piece in Education Researcher all about research practice partnerships. I think it's a really nice introduction. I know the William T. Grant website has a lot of great resources as well. Also, Bill Penuel and colleagues recently published a piece in the Review of Educational Research on collaborative research. I think these are really great pieces just to start thinking about what partnership research might actually look like if you're not familiar with it. So next slide, please. The question we get a lot is Spencer interested in? It's actually the most common question when I go visit universities or talk to scholars. They have an idea and they say, is Spencer interested in this thing? I have this idea, would Spencer be interested in it? The answer is probably. Topic is rarely what disqualifies proposals from our consideration. We'll talk more about what we are looking for in the second half. But as I mentioned several times, and it bears repeating, we're field initiated, which means our funding priorities are driven by the proposals we receive. We trust you as scholars to make a convincing case to us about what's important. And we find reviewers who are aligned with those scholars' interests to provide assessments on the proposed feedback to applicants. We certainly fund sociologists. We fund everyone else too. We receive proposals from a variety of disciplines, from the history of education, anthropology, philosophy, human development, psychology, economists. We fund a lot of different methodological approaches, from purely quantitative to advanced AI machine learning to deep and long ethnographic studies. So here are just some examples. I think this is a click through, so if you don't mind, Jim. Yep, perfect. So for example, the top bullet is a study of parent neighborhood networks. And these are proposals that are focused mostly in sociology, just as I've tried to pull up these examples. Parent neighborhood networks, and are looking at how those networks mediate and explain the relationship where their children go to school. Projects looking at higher education institutions and the stress or experiences that Black women, Black faculty members have in those spaces. Projects, sorry, I have to squint a little bit to read the slide. The role of economists in socio-historical and socio-technical devices in creating education reform, and sort of administrative responses to campus hate speech. Those are 4 examples. You can always check on each of the grant pages. We sort of highlight the most recent proposals that we funded. I'm going to hand it over now to Jenny, who's going to talk a little bit about William T. Grant.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And I just want to emphasize what Roy said, that we do have a microsite on our website, which gives you a lot of information about research practice partnerships, both from the side of the researcher and the practitioner. So feel free to check that out for more information about research practice partnerships. So again, my name is Jenny. I'm a program officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. I'm also a sociologist. And before I describe our funding opportunities today, I'm going to give you some background about the foundation and our 2 focus areas, or the major research areas in which we make grant awards. The William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936 as a private grant-making foundation by William T. Grant, who was the owner of a chain in 5 and dime stores. We fund about $7.5 million a year in research grants and about $12 billion a year across all of our grants programs. Since our founding, the foundation has worked to further understanding of human behavior through research. And we do this by focusing on the most pressing challenges confronting young people and supporting high quality research that is relevant to youth ages 5 to 25 in the United States. And that's really important for audience members to think about, that one of the constraints we have is that research must be focused on youth age 5 to 25 in the United States. Thanks, Jim. So I'm going to talk next about our 2 areas of focus for our grant making. Like the Spencer Foundation, we support field-initiated research, but across all of our grant programs, the research must fit with one of our 2 focus areas. The first focus area is reducing inequality, and the second focus area is focused on improving the use of research evidence, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The Reducing Inequality focus area was launched in 2014. What's defining about this initiative is that the focus is on responses to inequality, not its causes or consequences. There's a lot of great sociological research on the causes and consequences of inequality. There continues to be a lot of great research, but that's not what we're funding. What we fund is research that primarily focuses on ways to reduce or respond to inequality. And we support studies that help us understand how programs, policies, and practices can reduce inequality and outcomes among young people in the United States. We think that social scientists have a powerful role to play in figuring out how we can reduce inequality. So, for example, rather than just ending a journal article by saying if we just fix all these bad things, then we can reduce inequality, we really want to encourage researchers to focus on exploring what policies, programs, and practices are effective in reducing inequality and how those programs and policies and practices work. And this is why in the first column, on the left-hand side on the rationale, I've highlighted programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality and youth outcomes in purple, because we fund a lot of different kinds of studies, just like the Spencer Foundation, descriptive studies that clarify processes and mechanisms, intervention studies that test whether or not interventions work to reduce inequality. We also fund measurement studies that generate new measures that can enhance the work of researchers, practitioners, or policymakers. But whatever we fund, and this is especially important for those of you who are interested in conducting descriptive studies, we have to see a clear pathway to how the research can inform programs, policies, and practices to reduce inequality. And I just wanted to really highlight that because that's important to keep in mind. I also want to highlight that at the foundation, we are primarily interested in studies that focus on inequality on the basis of economic standing, race, ethnicity, immigrant origin status, and also language minority status. As we say in our grant materials, we're open to research exploring other areas, but I will tell you that what's more appealing about studies that do that, aside from making a compelling case about why you're focusing on a different dimension of inequality, so for example, gender or sexual identity, it's preferable that we see the ways in which that status you're exploring intersects with these other statuses we're interested in, like economic standing, race, and ethnicity. And I do want to emphasize again, we fund quantitative work, qualitative work, mixed method studies. What's important for us is that the research is rigorous, it will answer the question asked, and it's going to explore some way or some process to reduce inequality. You can go to the next slide, Jim. Thanks. So as a foundation that invests considerable dollars in research, we want to know how to produce useful evidence and ways to support its use to improve youth outcomes. So because we're interested in reducing inequality, we want to see that all the good research that's being produced can actually inform ways to reduce inequality. We suspect this often happens when research is used to inform and shape policy and practice. And so in 2008, the foundation launched an initiative to understand ways to improve the use and usefulness of research evidence in decision making. In 2015, this initiative was refocused. So the defining feature now is that we focus on strategies to improve the use of research evidence rather than just on barriers to use. We support studies that help us understand how to create the conditions that improve the production and use of research evidence in ways that benefit youth. And I encourage you, because this area of research is likely unfamiliar to many of you, to explore the many resources on our website that are addressed to researchers with an awareness that most people don't go into graduate school or don't go into the profession to study the use of research evidence. This is something that's quite different, but we're encouraging scholars to really use their methodological expertise and their substantive expertise to think about how research can be used more effectively. And certainly in time periods like this, when institutions must shift rapidly, it's important to have substantive and rigorous research that can inform policymakers and practitioners. And if we can better understand the conditions under which research is effectively used, that can help us make more effective progress towards reducing inequality among youth. Go to the next slide, Jim. I'm going to talk now about 3 different areas of grant making at the foundation, spending most of my time talking about research grants and the Scholars Program and less time talking about our 3rd newest program. Our research grants program is our largest program at the foundation, and under this program, I'm sorry about the lawn noise if you can hear that in the background here. Under this research grants program, we fund major research grants, which are for awards of $100,000 to $600,000 in the Reducing Inequality Initiative, or up to $1 million in the Use of Research Evidence Initiative. And we also fund smaller awards, which we call our Officers Research Grants, that are for $50,000 or less. Now, bear in mind that if you submit an application for one of these research grants, major research grants or an officer's research award, they have to fit into one of our 2 focus areas. So they have to be studies of ways to reduce inequality or studies of improving the use of research evidence. Again, they're field initiated, so what we're looking for is rigorous, interesting, increasingly looking for innovative studies that address ways to reduce inequality among youth. We have 3 deadlines per year, and these do not shift no matter what is happening in the larger society, because like, as I'm sure is true at Russell Sage and Spencer, we've got a lot of work to do behind the scenes, so we have to keep on track with those deadlines. One of these deadlines just passed for us. August 4th, we received 230 applications for major research grants and officers research awards combined. So I'm looking at the next couple of 2 to 4 weeks of reading a lot of letters of inquiry. There's about a 6 to 8 week response time where you know the status, whether or not you've been declined or moved to the next round. What we do initially is we do an internal review for fit with current interest and funding criteria. A subset of those letters of inquiry, roughly 16 to 18% will be invited to submit full proposals. Like the other foundations here, we send our full proposals out for external review. At least 2 external reviewers are recruited for each application. And then we do an internal review, multiple rounds of internal review when those proposals come back, and then some PIs are asked to respond to reviews. We make grants every year after our board meeting because our board does approve the grants we recommend to them. Sometimes they don't approve them, but usually they do. And those meetings take place in March, June, and October. So depending on when grants, letters of inquiry are submitted and when full proposals come in, awards are made at the end of March, end of June, and end of October. And I'll talk a little bit later about the kinds of things we look for when we receive these applications. So Jim, we can go to the next slide on the Scholars Program. The Scholars Program is our career development program. And the important thing to notice here is that what we really try to do with this program is give promising scholars an opportunity to stretch their substantive and or methodological expertise. So when these applications are submitted, and they have to be submitted within 7 years of receiving your PhD, these are interdisciplinary awards. So like the Spencer Foundation, not only do sociologists apply, not only are sociologists funded, but we also receive applications from economists, political scientists, anthropologists, education scholars, lots of different fields. Applications are submitted where folks are submitting essentially a research agenda. So they can propose one large project or up to 3 different projects that are related in some way. Funding is for 5 years. Again, the key thing about this award is that applicants have to provide a really compelling and well-developed plan for how they plan to stretch their methodological or substantive expertise, because our intention with these awards is that they enable promising early career scholars to do things they wouldn't be able to do otherwise without this award. So learn to do discourse analysis when you've never done it before. Learn to do some kind of quantitative analysis that you've never used before in your work. Study literature in adolescent development when thus far you've only looked at research on elementary age children. So just keep that in mind as you think about possibly developing an application. Another thing you have to do for this application is identify 2 mentors to help guide your stretch areas. These should be mentors that you can know them, but you shouldn't already have an established relationship with them. And your mentors that you identify should be involved in helping you develop your proposal and your mentoring plans, because the mentoring component is really a key component of the Scholars Program, and we encourage mentors and applicants to develop key goals and plans for how they're going to work together to achieve stretch goals. The application deadline is in July, so if this is something you're thinking about, I would say start thinking about it now. Our deadline is just passed, but these are quite intensive applications that you'll want to plan for well in advance. And cohorts of these scholars, we fund anywhere from 3 to 5 scholars per year. They get to be really close to one another. It's an amazing program, and come together once a year for a workshop. You can go to the next slide, Jim. So this is the last program I just want to quickly flag for you. This is our newest grant program. It's the Institutional Challenge Grant, and I just want to highlight a few things about it and encourage you to consult our website for more information if this is something you're interested in. to begin talking with deans or other leadership at your institution, because the key thing about this grant is that your leadership have to be really invested in this grant, because what we want to do with this program is encourage institutions of higher education to examine and redesign their internal policies and practices in ways that encourage sustained institutional partnerships with public agencies or nonprofit organizations, and ways that actually incentivize exceptional researchers to initiate and pursue rigorous and relevant research agendas, and in ways that improve the partnership skills of researchers. Because we recognize that while many scholars want to do research that is used by policymakers and practitioners, that work is not always supported and rewarded by institutions of higher education. So the intent of this award is to encourage institutions to shift those incentive structures. And we've been fortunate in the past couple of years to partner for the last 2 years with the Spencer Foundation in awarding an additional grant, institutional challenge grant. And this past year, Doris Duke also joined us as well. So we were able to award 3 institutional challenge grants this year. And again, please see our website for more information about this grant. And if it's something you're interested in, begin talking with leadership at your institution who are willing to rethink incentive structures that you have in place. I think now it's your turn, Jim.
Jenny, thank you very much. So I am program director at the Russell Sage Foundation. I've been here about 11 years now. And as you see here, for the improvement of social and living conditions in the United States, this was part of Margaret Olivia Sage's letter of gift to when she endowed the foundation. And because of this clause in the letter of gift, we focus our work in the US. We fund very little work outside of the US. We fund basic social science research in our core program areas. And we have been doing this now since at least World War II. I want to talk a little bit about our programs and funding mechanisms. Before I get to that, I just want to make a quick note as I was thinking about what Jenny and Roey were saying. Both of them talked about going to the websites. I want to be clear that of the three websites from WT Grant, Russell Sage, and the Spencer Foundation, I've heard from development officers over the time, and the feedback they give is that our websites are amongst the most transparent out there. You can find virtually any kind of information about the foundation, what our granting processes are, what our programs are, what the process is. So virtually everything we're going to talk about in here can be found on our websites. Jenny and Roy may add more later, but I do encourage you to go to the websites as if you're thinking about submitting an LOI to the foundation. We have 4 core programs, one in behavioral economics, one in the future of work, one in race, ethnicity, and immigration, one in social, political, and economic inequality. All of these programs have been around for at least 20 years or more. We have a commitment to these programs, and we will continue to work in them. You can find descriptions of all of these on our website, so I won't provide a lot of detail about them. We also run special initiatives on an occasional basis. Currently, we have a special initiative in decision-making and human behavior in context, and one in immigrant and immigrant integration. We recently had special initiatives in biology and social science, as well as computational social science, amongst others. These special initiatives are always geared specifically to our core programs, either one specific one or across programs. Decision-making and human behavior in context, for example, is tied to our program in behavioral economics. Our immigration and immigrant integration special initiative is related to our race, ethnicity, and immigration program. In May of 2020, in response to the COVID pandemic, we developed funding priorities on the social, political, economic, and psychological consequences of the pandemic. And this past summer, we've emphasized our funding priorities on systemic racial inequality and recent mass protests. These will remain funding priorities moving forward, I would expect, for at least a couple of years, but we'll begin accepting the LOIs in our standing programs again as of the November deadline. And we'll continue to make adjustments on these programs and special initiatives as we move forward. So getting to our website and checking it on a regular basis is always a good idea. The way we fund in these program areas, we do it in several ways. We have external research grants. We provide research grants up to $175,000 over a 2-year period in our trustee grants program. And we fund presidential grants up to $50,000. Both of these are identical, except that our presidential grants do not need to go to our board for approval. We currently have a pipeline grants competition, which we're running in coordination with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's primarily geared towards tenure-track faculty who have not had a previous RSF research grant, and there's a priority to scholars who are underrepresented in the social sciences. The next deadline for that is November 4th. We offer small grants for doctoral students and recent graduates. These are currently restricted to behavioral economics, although we are talking about extending it to our other program areas. We occasionally have targeted competitions. In this case, targeted competitions with big data. We held a joint competition with the William T. Grant Foundation to fund projects analyzing the Educational Opportunity Monitoring Project, which was put together by Sean Reardon and his colleagues. I should note that Spencer was involved in the development of that data set. So we have a long history of working with both WT Grant as well as Spencer in terms of sponsoring research in a variety of ways. So this we do have this targeted competition currently with supporting research with the Stanford Education Data Archive. And we're expecting another round of the CETA competition this fall. We have a number of visiting fellowships. Our signature program is the Visiting Scholar Program. We typically fund up to about 17 or 18 scholars each year to come to the foundation in residence. We provide a subsidized apartment a block down the street from the foundation. We give an office, some research support to work on projects largely when scholars are on sabbatical. We also have a visiting researcher program for individuals who don't need financial support. Again, we give an office and a subsidized apartment. And we also have started a visiting journalist program. We have been supporting over the last 3 or 4 years a number of summer institutes for doctoral students and junior faculty. These are largely summer institutes where it's difficult for individuals to get exposure to these topic areas in their home institutions. So we currently are supporting 7 different summer institutes. They're typically about 2 weeks. One in behavioral economics, one in social science genomics, one in the biological approaches to the social sciences, one in computational social science, one in the migration research methods, and one in social science for journalists. We'll also have a proposal development summer institute next year. It's unfortunate many of this year's institutes were postponed until next year due to COVID, although the CSS Summer Institute was entirely virtual and, at least from my understanding at this point, quite successful. And then finally, we have long had a publishing arm where we've published books, but we've also launched our own journal, peer-reviewed open access journal. You can submit an application or proposal for a journal issue, and each issue usually involves a call for articles. This is probably going to look very familiar to what Jenny just went over. It's our grant review process. We take letters of inquiry 3 times a year. It's a multi-stage process. Once the letter of inquiry is submitted, we just passed the deadline 2 days ago. So much like Jenny, I'm going to be focused on LOIs over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Doing that internal review. Basically, what we're looking for with the internal review is fit with the foundation's interest. For LOIs that get through the internal review, we send those out for external peer review. We typically look for 3 external reviewers. Those reviewers tend to be interdisciplinary and with expertise in the particular topic area of the letter of inquiry. An LOI should really be viewed as a mini proposal and well balanced. For example, it doesn't make, these are 5 pages. It doesn't make sense to spend 2 pages on a literature review or a page on your qualifications. What you want to do typically is spend an abbreviated amount of time, maybe a page, page and a half, that lays out the problem and your main research questions. And then you want to spend a fair amount of time, or at least most of the rest of the LOI, focused on indicating why the data and methods that you are using will help you answer the questions that you're posing. So you really want to lay out enough detail about your research design, your data, your questions, your hypothesis, your samples and sampling strategy, power calculations, analytical approach, substantiating how all of those will help you answer the questions that you're posing. In terms of LOIs, the number that we receive, historically, we received between 200 and 300 each funding cycle. Over the last few funding cycles, we have been looking more in the range of 400 to 700. So there is an increased interest in grants through the foundation. If the external peer review is positive, we'll issue an invitation to submit a full proposal. We typically send those full proposals back to the same reviewers, and we'll often add 1 or 2 more. If those reviews are largely positive, we'll ask for investigators to give us a response to the reviewer comments. So once those are all in, the application, the reviews, the investigator response will go to our standing advisory committees. We maintain standing advisory committees in each of our program areas. These are external academics recruited specifically for their expertise in each of our program areas. If the Standing Advisory Committee recommends the proposal to our board, it goes before our board for funding consideration. They can also decline proposals at that stage, as well as ask for reject and resubmits. And our board, much like William T. Grant, does the same thing. It's a very active board. If a proposal gets to our board, they have the option of approving, rejecting, or asking for revisions or changes. Again, much like William T. Grant, most of the proposals that get to our board get through without any trouble. But occasionally there are changes requested, or there may be issues that arise that lead to a rejection. I'll turn it back to Roy right now with some information that is pretty common to all 3 of our foundations.
Thank you. Yeah, there's not to reiterate a lot of the stuff that have been already shared, but I want to talk a little bit about what makes a proposal stand out in a crowded field. I think that Russell Sage and William T. Grant and Spencer both receive a lot of proposals, and we can't fund everything that we get. Spencer, we fund about 60 small grants a year, between 10 to 15 large grants and 5 LILs, and that's our research area. Overall, we fund about $20 million in grants annually, but we can't fund everything. Our fund rate's about 5 to 10%. So we're looking for a couple factors that tip the scale, making a strong case for why the questions need to be answered, for improving education, and a strong case for your methods. So are they sufficient to answer your questions? Next slide, Jim. I'm going to get a little bit into the specifics of it. What we're looking for, really what we're asking our reviewers to look for and to rate and comment, is about whether or not you have a compelling rationale for the study based on the relevant research and a clear focus of inquiry. And the second part is whether or not you have a compelling and sufficient level of information about your data collection procedures, research setting, participants, and detailed information about your analysis. So just the first two bullets. It's important for your proposal to have a focus on, and be focused on topics or issues related to learning or education. That's for Spencer specifically. I know that the Russell Sage and William T. Grant have different types of foci, but I would just say for Spencer specifically, education has to be at the center of this work. This is often the most exciting and interesting part of a scholar's proposal. So program officers and reviewers tend to really grapple onto an idea and really like this idea. It's where we get to see your passions. We found that scholars choose to focus on topics or issues for a variety of reasons, oftentimes focusing their attention on filling significant gaps in research, but also some find that there are some competitive proposals are focused on a critical or emerging trends, or taking aim at a unexpected or puzzling or contradictory findings, or some sort of intuitive finding this popping up in the field. The key, though, is to connect this to why is it important to understand this topic, really connecting it to other research literature. So how have other researchers treated the same topic? And then also connect, so using research and theory, you can develop a deeper explanation as to why you're studying your topic, and then also a theoretical conceptual framework explaining the key relationships between and within the ideas in your project. In terms of a compelling data collection plan, analysis plan, this is actually where we find the proposals tend to sort of degrade, I guess. It's one of the most common reasons we turn out of proposals, because the analysis plan or the data collection plan are incomplete or underspecified. So you want to make sure that your research design is situated in such a way that's going to yield findings that are of value. I mean, that's obvious, and we've all learned that. The thing that it's important to consider is different scholars are going to take this, have different approaches to research questions or lines of inquiry, and they have different equally valid designs. I'm going to speak generally about some of the things we like to see in proposals, and you can always go to our website. We have a draft of a guide on under our grant resources that will tell you some of the specific mistakes that people make. So compelling proposals provide a convincing rationale for the design of the study, making your choices explicit, explaining how your research design is well situated to answer your research questions, your line of inquiry. It's important to show readers that the choices you're making, things like your research sites, participants, sample size, variable selection, whatever is appropriate for your particular approach, these decisions were made purposefully and with an eye towards answering your research questions. Regardless of your approach, you should describe all the key concepts under investigation, how they're operationalized in your study, how they're observed in your data. This is where conceptual framework or theoretical framework is really important to have. You may want to explain your data collection tools and protocols. You can provide copies of those in appendices. You don't need to belabor them, but they should be available and ready to examine. Similarly, you should explain your analytic methods. Oftentimes we get proposals that will say, 2 lines, I'm going to use grounded theory. They'll cite, Glaser or Charmés or someone, and they'll just, and then they'll say, and that will produce the answers to my questions. We need to know a little bit more about your process, your analytic process. So take care to show your analytic techniques and how they'll yield results. If there are multiple steps of iteration of data, if there are multiple ways in which you're going to be analyzing data quantitatively, or there's a particular approach that's best suited for this. I just read a proposal that went at least 3 or 4 paragraphs talking about why regression discontinuity was the best approach for this, and what value it adds to, and what are some of the drawbacks, and how they're addressing those drawbacks, or how they're making some sort of notes of those limitations. We really want to know that you spent a lot of time thinking about the approaches, not just that you have this hammer, so the problem of a nail is very obvious to you. You should approach your entire proposal is one big document with everything connected to each other. So these are the things that we look for. When I say we, I mean really the program staff and review panels, because unlike Russell Sage and William T. Grant, a lot of the decisions are made around funding at Spencer are done at the program level, they're done by review panels, and they're done at the level of the president. So we are really a community of scholars that are trying to make these decisions. And I'm, as are the boards, but I think that's one of those unique one of the unique formats that Spencer has is that it doesn't go through board approval. It really goes, their board has given us a considerable amount of leeway to make some of these decisions and then giving it to the president to make the final recommendations. So just talk about our review process really quickly. Next slide, thank you. I keep clicking as if I have that power, and I have to remember that I don't. Over the past year, we've been working to ensure that our review process serves as a means to support high quality education research. Our review process has really two goals. One is to support the field, and the other is to identify impactful proposals. So for this, it means that we construct a rigorous review process of providing recommendations to Spencer staff or to our selection committees, and also provides rigorous and important feedback to every eligible field-initiated research proposal. So this is one of those commitments we made 2 years ago, and I think we're still making good on this, is every proposal that comes into Spencer, oh, we just clicked off the slide. Thanks. Every proposal that comes into Spencer gets feedback. At the heart of our review process is our review panel. So each grant program has a standing review panel comprised of a diverse group of scholars. We try and match that panel as best we can to the proposals we anticipate getting. So we're looking for diversity of viewpoints and interests and methodologies. We have sociologists and economists and teacher educators. We have people who specialize in design-based approaches and action research, and also people who focus on structural equation modeling and machine learning. So we have a very big and wide variety of reviewers. And we try and match proposals to reviewers. Every proposal that comes in is generally read by at least 2 reviewers. One might be an expert in the method or the topic. The other one, or someone being an expert in the method, one other being an expert in the topic or the discipline. Some might be experts in both. We're really trying to make sure that the proposals that come in are matched appropriately to the reviewers who can judge that on the significance and the methodological rigor. So every proposal is read by 2 panelists. They write reviews basically on the top of the things I mentioned in the last slide, and they're thinking about the reviews as an assessment of the proposal and a way to give feedback. They give also funding recommendations to us, and there might be a selection panel, or there might be a third reviewer who's brought in for larger projects to add a third expert review. Like I said, they're looking for things like the compelling rationale. They're looking for a clear use of research literature and theory, clear questions, sufficient information about data collection and analysis. And they're going to put all these things into feedback. And no matter what the decision is, that feedback is going to go back to the applicant. Our hope is that while we don't have a formal revise and resubmit protocol, we don't actively invite revisions, that the feedback will be helpful to scholars to develop new ideas and write more impactful proposals. So there's sort of a generative process to that. And just to say that we're also always looking for people to be on our review panel. So if you're interested, you can email me, contact me offline, and we can talk about that. Because we also found that oftentimes reviewers, by reading 20, 25 of these, they become better proposal writers as well. So how do you go about writing your proposal? So tips and tricks to writing successful proposals. I just mentioned what's compelling in our review process, but there are a couple basic things I'd like to communicate to everyone who's starting this process. And I think these are questions that, these are approaches that work broadly across a lot of different proposal writing spaces. So first is start with a question. Good proposals are question-driven. People might say, I want to study early childhood education expulsions or social justice within higher education or student-centered approaches to youth engagement. And we always say, these are great topics, but what's your question? A lot of us are topic-driven in our thinking, but proposals are question-driven in how they're written. So think about what the puzzle you're trying to understand, why is it significant, how will it contribute to or challenge our understanding of education. The next thing to think about is who's going to read your proposal. So as I mentioned, we have 2 panelists and a program officer reviewing every proposal. One of them is probably going to be very well aligned with their methods. The other one's going to be knowledge about your topic or discipline. Like I said, sometimes you get a good mixture of both, but at least one of the persons reading your proposal is not going to be an expert or specialized in your particular topic or methodology. So you have to also remember there's a generalist perspective to take. We try and align the reviewers, but you're going to have some parts of your proposal that have to speak to other people outside your specific subfield. We tell people, take a proposal, take it down the hall, take it to a colleague who's not an expert in your field, have them look at it, see if it makes sense to them, see if it's clear to them. The third thing we tell people is make sure everything is aligned, that the pieces fit together. We get proposals that have a great question or a great review of literature or a wonderful and interesting analysis plan, but they just don't connect to each other. You can use charts and graphs, you can use tables, you can do whatever sort of visual or rhetorical constructs you want, but you have to tell us what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and why it matters. And those are the parts from question to literature review to theoretical framing to methods. That's what makes it all fits together. So, for example, will my plans for data collection and conducting analysis answer my questions? Are you looking at the right data? Are you asking the right questions to the right people when you're doing interviews? And how will that contribute? And really draw that line for the reviewers. You really don't want to make them guess. You'll get some fans who will draw the lines for themselves, but you really want to make sure those things are as clear as possible. The last thing to consider is that we give feedback on every proposal. I know this might be unique to Spencer in the private funding space, but we want everyone to get constructive and honest feedback. We want you to improve your projects, and we want you to think about being competitive either in another funding cycle or with another funding organization. This is how the field grows. This is how good ideas are encouraged. This is how we sharpen our thinking. So take that feedback and use it. The thing that I think people oftentimes forget, and particularly younger scholars and people who are not necessarily affiliated with the foundation spaces regularly, at least with Spencer, is you can email us. We will set up a time to talk. We will every grant program has a email address of the program that I manage, which is the small grants program. It's smallgrants@spencer.org. Someone's monitoring that email. If you have a question about it, your project, or if you got a rejection, you want to help thinking about what that feedback means, you can reach out and there'll be someone who in the course of time will be able to answer your question. Maybe not a one-on-one meeting, but you'll get some sort of response, because we want to make sure that we're building a community of scholars. So my last additional tips, so the last slide that I have anyway. Just remember that your proposals are IOUs to a funder. You want to make a compelling case, but you don't want to overpromise. You want to be realistic about what you deliver and what's feasible. I actually sometimes encourage scholars to underpromise. If your underpromise is sufficient to get funding and you have a little bit of extra time and effort and you want to throw another research question in to do more work, that's great. But don't overpromise. People can see through that. People also see through hyperbolic statements like this is the most exciting or most interesting idea ever to, cross education research. The alternative is that some senior scholars also do what we call trust me proposals. They sort of glide over how they're going to do something, assuming that we simply trust them to execute it. We expect you to make the case. The number of senior scholars who don't get funding because they put their method section as a bulleted list at the end of, as a step-by-step bulleted list instead of explaining and giving you a rationale for it is, I mean, too many to count. Don't expect us to trust you. We really have to see those things laid out. Reviewers are really going to call people out for that. We also discover that it's essential to make everything align. I think I've said this several times. Supporting documents provides specific and ancillary information, but you also have to make all that alignment clearly in the program narrative, in your proposal narrative. So you can't just expect people to read we'll get an article and entered into the appendix saying, see this article, this is how I'm going to do my methods, or see this wonderful conceptual framework really well spelled out, but in its appendix. We really want to see that in the narrative, even if you have to refer to the appendix later and say, also see this for deeper explanation, more clarity. And the last thing is, don't use jargon. It's sort of it's common in the field for people to think that everyone understands exactly what they're saying, but not everyone's an insider to your field. There are going to be some generalists. Program officers at the Spencer Foundation, people who read the proposals, all have PhDs in education. We all focus on certain things. There's some terms that we're familiar with, and some terms that are very specific to understanding your specific field that someone outside of, say, sociology or some sort of of disability studies might not know. So make sure you explain your terms. Don't be so reductive. The substance is gone, but make sure there's a balance between using key terms and being clear. With that, I'm going to turn it back over. Actually, don't know who's next. Is it going back to Jenny? Yeah. Oh, no, Jim.
That would be me, yes. So let me just say first, everything Roy just said. Let me just sort of reiterate that. So when you're writing a proposal, as he sort of mentioned, everything for us really starts and ends with the research questions. The very first thing we look for in an LOI is whether the questions are consistent with our funding priorities and our programs. Only about a third of LOIs make it through our internal review process, and this is typically because many projects are not within our funding priorities. They may be related, but they're largely peripheral to what we're interested in, or they're proposing the use of funds outside of our purview. One of the first questions we ask our reviewers to answer is whether the questions are important and compelling. What's the motivation and importance of the questions being posed? Why should I care about it? What's exactly the contribution that you expect? Are you extending something, or are the questions that you're addressing really going to be paradigm changing? We can only really evaluate LOIs or projects if the key questions and hypotheses are clearly stated and identified. There are many LOIs that I read, and when I'm done reading those LOIs, it's interesting projects, but I don't really know what the question is. So again, you need to clearly state your questions and make sure that they're aligned well with the foundation's priorities. And then finally, do the data and methods allow you to answer the questions you pose? Once you pose your questions, there probably shouldn't be another word in your LOI or your proposal that doesn't directly show how the data and methods that you're using are going to help you answer the questions that you're posing. Powerful new data and our methods can't make up for uninteresting or irrelevant questions, and vice versa. A really interesting question, if you just have poor data or weak methods, is unlikely to go anywhere. And I also want to emphasize the importance of conveying an interdisciplinary understanding of the research in both the LOI and proposal, because the project, much like my colleagues, will be reviewed by experts from multiple disciplines. We fund sociologists, economists, political scientists, people from law. I could go on and on. And to give you an example, we had a project submitted to us 3 or 4 years ago that was looking at child developmental issues in relation to educational achievement. This was within a particular, the investigators were from a particular discipline. When we sent the proposal out for review, we kept in people from those investigators' disciplines, but we also sent it to a couple of child developmental psychologists. And the within discipline reviewers thought it was the greatest project ever. When we got the reviews back from the developmental psychologists, they thought it was a great project with one small problem. The notions of child development were outdated by about 30 years. And our advice to the investigators at that time were that they needed to bring on a developmental psychologist. And it's not uncommon for us to do that. One of the questions we ask our reviewers is there appropriate expertise to carry out the project? And it's not uncommon for us to recommend when inviting proposals that the investigators add on additional expertise. So I'm going to pass it back to Jenny now for some additional tips.
I just want to mention 2 things that, and one thing maybe in here, but you know, I realized this wasn't on my slide earlier. It may have been, and I just looked over it. But unlike Spencer, I just want to note that we don't just fund studies in the area of education, but we also fund studies in the area of juvenile justice, child welfare, youth employment. So be sure and, again, consult our website for the different areas, different settings in which we're interested. And the other thing I want to mention that diverges from what Roey said, and so I can't say everything he said because we're such a small staff. It is impossible for us to reply to all inquiries that come in. And so I know while development officers are increasingly encouraging researchers to reach out to program staff, I would ask you, along with other staff at the William T. Grant Foundation, because we're such a small staff and we don't have the capacity to respond, to please make good use of our website and our resources that are there. We make them, as Jim said, transparent and thorough for a reason, that we hope that you can understand both what we're looking for and what you have to do to submit an application based on what our website says. And so I encourage you to look there. We also provide, in most cases, I think right now, one thing we're missing is an annotated letter of inquiry, but we provide annotated proposals, a lot of different ways for you to think about how you should construct an application. And so I encourage you to make good use of those resources before you reach out. Of course, if there's a question that's not answered, you should reach out to ask it. But just know that we can't respond to a lot of questions. We can't, especially questions where people write and say, does this fit? Does this fit? Does this fit? Those are questions we just don't have time to respond to. And we certainly aren't able to read LOIs before they're submitted and offer guidance, because that's just not fair to all applicants who are submitting. So again, websites are there for a reason. Please make as good a use as you can of those, to again try to look at whether or not the fit of your application is strong. We're also interested in whether or not projects are relevant for policy or practice. As we say in our materials, we don't expect any one project is going to change policy or practice, but we do want to see a clear way in which a project might inform policy or practice. Even if studies are proposed in our Reducing Inequality initiative, sometimes people are actually testing programs that are meant to shift practice. But in cases where you're trying to examine processes that might inform the development of a policy or practice, we want to see the clear link between how what you're doing could potentially inform a program or policy or practice down the line. As others have said, it's important that your work is going to add to theory and prior empirical work, and that you're submitting an idea and a question that is compelling to the field and it's going to build on what's already there. And as others have said, it's more important for us that you tackle a few questions well, rather than trying to cover the waterfront and do everything. You can move to the next slide. I think I have one more slide, Jim. I don't know that anything I'm going to say here is going to, I don't want to repeat what Jim and Roy have already said, other than, sometimes we get LOIs that are 4 pages when we have a 5-page maximum length, and it's hard to get everything you want to say into 5 pages, but if they're not 5 pages, then they're probably not sufficiently describing what you need to describe in order for us to make a decision about whether or not to invite a proposal. So both letters of inquiry and proposals, if you're invited to submit one, should be to provide sufficient information so that both internal and external reviewers have enough information to make decisions about how well the project is going to be carried out and how well it's going to inform the research that's already out there. And another thing I want to mention, should you advance through our process to the stage where you're invited to submit a response, so this is the last stage before we make deliberations about what projects we'll recommend for funding, some reviewers, so you're invited to submit a proposal, and then a small number of those folks who submit a proposal and receive external reviews are then invited to respond. It's always important to respond to both external and internal reviews seriously, graciously, and in depth. I hear a lot of people say, they get the reviews back, whether or not you're declined or asked to move forward, they get the reviews back, they take a day or even longer to process everything before they respond. And so sometimes, for example, we give feedback to people, it may not be something they think is a direction they need to take in their research. Well, at least you need to at least address that concern that's been raised in depth. And again, graciously, it's important to keep in mind. So I'll just end there, Jim, and I think those are my last slides. And yeah.
Back to me, I guess. Yeah. I just want to actually go back to something that Jenny said and just reiterate. We do accept and welcome emails. You might get redirected back to our website, even if you have an email. If it's something we think is answered clear on the website, the administrative assistant or the program officer might say, check our website out. Here's the FAQs. You might get through. We do not pre-read proposals because we are part of that review process. So I think those are two good points. Thanks for raising them, Jenny. Some final thoughts. So this is a difficult process. This is something that not everyone gets right the first time. As sort of Jenny alluded to, if you get feedback, respond to it graciously. If you think something was very clear in your proposal and it wasn't, because the reviewer, it might not have been as clear as you think if the reviewer didn't see it. It's not the reviewer's wrong. Sometimes reviewers do miss things, but it's about, think about how that reflects about your writing and your process. And you're probably not going to get it right the first time. I think on average, when we looked at some of the data around proposals, we're funding 5 to 10% of our total proposals that come in, which means most people don't get funded on their first try. I think the average person submits 1.6 times every 5 years. So we are getting some resubmissions. We're seeing some slight increase. We encourage people to think about that and to really reflect on that feedback and how they can make improvements. Don't take a rejection as sort of a complete dismissal of your life's work or your project and wherever it stands. We encourage you to read each other's work, read published articles, read white papers, share your proposals with colleagues, ask colleagues to read, if they'll read your proposals, read other people's proposals if they offer it. It's a really great way to build up capacity, your own capacity. It's a really great way to build up the field's capacity. If you're early career, consider partnering with an advanced scholar. I know this is something that William T. Grant has been sort of leading on, is this idea of diverse teams. And one of the measures of diversity is intergenerational, and having some sort of mentor-mentee relationship with people who have been there before, who have gotten funding or have just sort of had general experience writing proposals. It's not a bad thing to take on a co-PI role. Or if the senior scholar is gracious enough to take on that co-PI role and make you the PI to work with them and learn from that process. It's a great way to develop a track record. Our smaller grants are a great place for younger scholars to start, but as the dollar values go up, people become a little bit more focused on what that CV says and whether or not there's a history of success and whether or not it fits with a track record of research. And the last thing to think about is keep applying. We are limited in the number of proposals we accept. You can't be a PI or co-PI in multiple proposals at the same time. So we have a little bit of a governor on the system, but we encourage you to not be discouraged by the process. If a project doesn't work for Spencer, but you think it might work for William T. Grant or Russell Sage, we're not in competition with each other in this. We really want to fund the best research out there, and sometimes it's not a perfect fit. But there are other funders out there where it might be a really good fit. The number of proposals we see that we look at and we say, oh, it's not a great fit for Spencer, but then turn around and get funded by the National Science Foundation. It's not that we didn't like it, it just wasn't a fit for our portfolio. It didn't, our reviewers raised some questions that really maybe couldn't have been written in a 4,000 word proposal, maybe needed more space, and so IES or NSF was a better space. I personally once wrote a Lyle proposal back before I was a member of the Spencer team. They got turned down. It went through the process, but got turned down, and we turned it around. And later, 2 years later, I believe William T. Grant funded it after I was left the project. But sometimes projects move around foundations, and that's a wonderful thing once it gets life. It will just keep getting better and better the more feedback you get. So keep applying. That's all I have. So thank you.
Jenny, any final thoughts?
No final thoughts. I'll just underscore that apply again. Certainly that's important to do.
I do think that one of the things that should have come across is that we do get, all of us get many more really good applications than we could possibly fund. And so the advice to take reviews seriously, and that simply because we turn you down once, if we do, it is always worth thinking that if you have a project that you think fits with what we're doing or what Spencer is doing or what Grant is doing, it never hurts to go back and see if the project that you're currently thinking about is a better fit for the foundation the second time around. I can tell you that I have known visiting scholar applications to get funded on the third, to be accepted on the third or fourth round. And we have had grants, people applying for grants, be turned down multiple times and then finally be funded at a later date. So the main point there is it is worth it if you think you have a project that fits with what the foundation is about, to go ahead and consider submitting an LOI. That's going to be my concluding comments. I think we'll take questions. We're asking that you submit questions through the Q&A as opposed to chat. Let's see, we have 2 open questions at the moment.
I think it was really just, I think it was just this one question.
Yeah, just the one.
And I can just say, this is not the type of thing William T. Grant would fund. I don't know if everyone can see the question and answer. Can they see it? Or
let me read it.
Sure.
I've done field research during my PhD studies in a non-US institution and have a publisher interested in publishing it as a monograph. However, I need to do substantive editing work on it. What would be the best way to go about seeking funds to support that kind of work? I understand most funding is made for field research, but I'm interested in seeking funds for formatting, editing, finalizing. Ideas or suggestions? I can tell you that Russell Sage does not support this kind of work. We're primarily interested in funding the analysis and writing of results, but we don't really provide support for the formatting and editing at the very end stage.
Yeah, similarly, Spencer likes to fund whole research projects, not portions of them. There are instances where, say, historians might be essentially doing a book project, but it really requires us to look at the sort of the methods, the analysis, where they're going to get their archival research, how they're thinking about the frameworks of it. So we don't tend to fund the back end of studies.
I have one.
There was a question in the chat.
Can the panelists speak to how graduate student status affects the likelihood of grant receipt other than fellowships? Jenny?
The William T. Grant Foundation only funds graduate students sort of indirectly through our mentoring grants, and those mentoring grants are only awarded to folks who have research grants or other grants, scholars awards, and sometimes those researchers apply for a mentoring award within the foundation. And the Scholars Award, for example, has to be given to someone within 7 years of receiving their PhD. You know, I actually don't know off the top of my head if I think we have an explicit restriction for our major research grants that you have to have a PhD to be eligible for those. So either postdocs or faculty members or folks at other kinds of research institutions would be eligible. Oh, that's not true. You don't have to have a PhD. What am I talking about? But you know, I have to look at that. Actually, we don't see many applications from graduate students. Usually, folks are postdocs or researchers at research institutes. I'll stop there because I don't have a perfect answer to that question. So I suppose it's possible, it just doesn't usually happen.
At RSF, because we don't provide a lot of support for graduate students, at least in terms of our external grant awards, we have a small number of programs. Our summer institutes are geared towards graduate students. We have a small grants program that we're thinking about expanding to all of our program areas. As I said before, it's strictly limited to our behavioral economics program at the moment. That is targeted at advanced graduate students. And typically, some of our targeted competitions will provide some support for graduate students as well. But as a general matter, we require that individuals have a PhD for external grants or visiting scholar fellowships, or at least the demonstrated capacity to carry out high-level research. And that's typically built with experience as opposed to education. So we're looking for people who may have earned a master's and then spent the last decade working in a research-focused environment. We will consider applications like that where individuals do not have a PhD, but generally we do require some sort of doctoral degree.
I think Spencer is similar to William T. Grant and Russell Sage in that we generally require a PhD for our grant programs to be a co-PI or PI. Graduate students can be on projects. They can be either listed as graduate students or people without doctoral degrees can be investigators, but they cannot be named co-PIs or PIs on the grants. The only space that we do have available for graduate students are our fellowship program, the NAD fellowship programs.
Other questions or ways in which we might be able to follow up on what we presented here, or anything that we did not cover that might be helpful to know? Then I'd like to thank you all very much for taking your Saturday afternoon or late Saturday morning and joining us for our grant panel. I hope you found it useful. You have our website information right here, at least on RSF, and I think Roy mentioned this as well. There may be one for WT Grant. We have a generic email address. Oh, I've got one more question. Can you provide tips for postdoctoral researchers who are independent and lack institutional affiliation but have project collaborators? Jenny or Roy?
For us, the PI has to be affiliated with a nonprofit organization. So you'd have to be affiliated with a university or some other nonprofit organization in order to serve as a PI on a grant, but certainly folks often have consultants or other people involved with their grants who are not affiliated with a research institution.
Go ahead.
Similar for Spencer, it was we actually had some issues during some of the shedding of faculty from a lot of universities where people became unaffiliated after being awarded grants, and we still maintain that nonprofit we can't give to non-nonprofit organizations or individuals. So, but we've also found this actually not so difficult to become affiliated if you or work with people who are affiliated, that you can run contracts through them.
And again, with RSF, that's exactly the same. You have to have some sort of institutional affiliation. Although if you know someone who is submitting an application for an award, you can be a paid consultant on those types of, if the award is awarded. But that's the only way without an institutional affiliation that you can receive funds through the foundation. Another question, can you give some details about the turnaround time between the LOI acceptance and when full proposals are due? Jenny or Roy?
So it takes us, once an LOI comes in, 6 to 8 weeks to respond to invite a full proposal. And at that point, we usually give people the choice of 2 deadlines, which can be anywhere from 3 to 6 months away. So I would say, so that means from the point of hearing about whether or not you're invited to submit a proposal, you can choose a shorter turnaround of, it's usually, I guess, 2 to 3 months, or a longer turnaround of closer to 5 to 6 months. And then if you're then invited to submit a response, if you've gotten favorable reviews, we want your proposal to move forward, you have about a month to submit a response to concerns.
For Spencer, we have slightly different timelines depending on the projects, and we don't, so we're new to the LOI space with respect to our large grant projects. I can't really speak to and we also don't currently make a cut at the LOI stage. We just use that to calibrate our reviewers. So I can speak generally saying that because we run 2 large grant cycles a year, we try and make our funding decisions between 6 to 7 months from the initial deadline, sometimes 8 months, depending on where the deadlines fall on the calendar. For small grants, we run that program 3 times a year. we tell people 5 to 6 months is the turnaround from decision point, from submitting to decision point, but it's oftentimes closer to 5 months into 6 months. We're trying to, obviously working with the workflow, not have multiple deadlines piling up on program staff and reviewers. So we try and make those decisions within the time frame. If you look at our deadlines, usually within the time frame between one deadline to the next in the same program, maybe a few months after. So for projects that are done annually, timeline's about a year, sometimes a little quicker.
So for Russell Sage, we received LOIs 2 days ago on August 5th, 3 days ago. We're expecting to consider full proposals from those LOIs at our board meeting in March. So that's about 6.5 months from the point of submission of the LOI to the funding, the actual funding of proposals. Usually takes about 2 to 2.5 months before we would invite a proposal from LOIs. So we would be looking to invite full proposals sometime in late November, I think. Do I have my timeline right? Sometime in November. And then we usually give people about 4 to 6 weeks to submit the full proposals once it's invited. Other questions? Anything we can clarify that we've covered? All right then. Again, let me start over. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on wherever you are. Again, you have the foundation website information. All of those websites, I think, will have emails. At least let me speak for RSF. We do have an email, a generic email address that you can pose questions to. There's always someone monitoring it. And I hope that you have a lovely rest of the virtual sociology meetings for 2020. Thank you all very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye. All right. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you all
Jim.
very
Thanks,
much.
Roy.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking over at the last minute.
Yeah, this is fun.
Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your summer.
You too.
Take it easy.
Bye, all.
Bye.